If you have an audience of 10,000 and 100 pay $8 a month, you're making $800 a month off of that. And that's probably a lot more than you would be generating off of affiliates, maybe even merch. Well, we run a little Roomba here.
Oh, yeah, that thing's a demon.
Yeah, it goes hard. It like destroys everything in its way. And it's fun though. It's why those cords are always a mess. Those cords are always a mess. But I just keep running it. Sometimes it knocks the pictures down. I just keep running it every night. You know, it's cleaning stuff up.
It's also knocking the iPhones down on the floor though.
Yeah, but they're like iPhone 4s, you know?
Did Danny ever tell you that story about the reality TV girls that were like on a show from like 10 years ago, came in asking for new phones? They asked if they could have our iPhone 4.
What?
Yeah. He said their phones were like cracked and
oh my
old.
Gosh. Wait, really?
Yeah.
I'm so glad we didn't just like say, oh, okay, sure, here you go. Wait, that's so funny. I need to ask Danny about that.
Yeah. I don't remember what show they're on, but I don't know.
I guess the royalties aren't that good anymore.
Oh.
Not this far after it.
All right. So let's begin.
Let's do it.
My guest today, I met him through iTunes, and 36 emails later, we now work together in Hollywood. It's my boss, Colin Thomson.
Yo, what's up?
How you doing, man?
I'm great. 36 emails?
36 emails in that first chain.
Was that, interesting. So you reached out to me. I'm trying to remember. You reached out to me and you were like, hey, I do podcast editing.
Yeah.
And then what did I say? Go away, kid.
Pretty much. I don't know. Like,
no, I didn't.
Here's the headspace I was in back then. It was like I had one good client.
Mm-hmm.
And I had just like come down off of getting banned from Upwork, and I cold pitched Cortland Allen of India.
Oh, see, this is why I know we're on the same wavelength, because you got banned from Upwork for just messaging so many people trying to get. Why'd you get banned?
I got banned because I was trying to take work off the platform, and I didn't know that. Oh, I didn't know that was a no-no. I was like, oh, this is a great way to meet people.
We can talk off camera about, how to accomplish that process correctly. But yeah, interesting. Yeah, you can't just like type it into the messages. Hey, let's work on a platform other than Upwork.
Well, it's like PayPal. I was just like, oh, if you want to do any future work, just like let me know and you can PayPal me.
Mm-hmm. They want their cut.
Yeah.
That's how their business
20
works.
or 30% cut. I don't remember.
It's a chunk.
It is a chunk. I don't want to talk too much about that. Let's talk about how people can make money with their podcast, because that's something that you excel at through Kast Media. But I guess before we begin, we should give a little background. You actually had a podcast once called The Modern Musician Show. And that's actually how I found you. Going back to me pitching, like cold pitching people, I was spending time on the iTunes charts, just like looking up shows that have similar interests to mine, and just like, the little link to the website, click that link, find the email address, cold pitch. And I remember you put out an episode about why the feed was dead. Like you hadn't published an episode in months, and you did like a recap of like, here's why I've been gone. I'm building this company, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And like, I guess another interesting side note too was I had just got off a call with Gary Vaynerchuk's team. Like I had talked to his, basically his right-hand man for like 2 hours about setting up their podcast studio. And they were essentially interviewing me for the same role I'm doing now here at Kast, except they never took the plunge like on me. And it still pisses me off to this day, because like everything, how it's set up is like exactly how I recommended, and the different equipment. But the thing is like that validated that I had something going. I was like, okay, so cold pitching these single shows on iTunes is a slow process. Very, very few people actually responded. Even fewer like took me up on it. But I knew that you were going to be different because you had the experience in the podcast space, like actually podcasting, and then you built a company out of that. And I've always felt like I'm a few years behind you, you know? And it's like,
I don't know about that. I'm a few years behind you on the, especially on the technical elements of audio. I can edit audio all right. I can make it sound fine with some built-in plugins, but you elevate it. You elevate all the audio stuff we do here to a whole new level.
yeah, but you excel in the realm of networking and monetizing shows. And that's kind of the backbone of Kast Media at this point is... Let me just stop talking and ask you, what is Kast Media? What do we do here? And
yeah. So we are a podcast network, but I think important to what we do is the story of how we got here, because it does feed into how we're different than I think all the other podcast networks. So like you mentioned, I had a podcast way back when, and I thought, well, first of all, I was a musician, studied music composition in college, and taught piano when I first moved out to LA. And I was really obsessed with how musicians can make a living. So that was the idea of the podcast I decided to host. I wanted to ask successful musicians about how they run the business side of their music, essentially. Like, how can you make a living today in music? Especially because it's so different. Distribution is all different. Spotify, like all of these different things. So that was the reason that I started the podcast. I probably only ran it for like 2.5, 3 months, something like that. But I went hard because for some reason I decided I wanted to do 3 episodes a week. I only get excited about something if I really go all in. Yeah. So I was doing 3 episodes a week, probably for like 2.5 months. I'm pretty sure I got to episode like 60, mid 60s, somewhere in there. But I got plugged in through that process to Facebook groups of like indie podcasters trying to figure out how to do it and all that stuff. And a lot of them were just asking questions about, the audio, like pure like editing audio stuff, which is, when you've done that on the music side of things, it's like podcasting is kind of a piece of cake comparatively. And so I started out by just helping out other indie podcasters edit their episodes, intros, outros, musics, call to actions, ads in the middle, editing out ums and ahs, all of the stuff. I started out just doing that and, charging like an hourly fee for it. And that was the origination of Kast Media. That's what this eventually turned into, because then it kind of spiraled out of control from there, because then they would just ask me, oh, do you write show notes? Do you write descriptions? Do you do, Twitter posts about it? Do you do Instagram images about it? Will you follow up with my guest afterwards? And the answer to all of those questions was yes, of course. Of course I do all of those things, and then like figure it out.
Right.
And so I think that informs where we are now, because now we're a network that on the surface looks similar to, we can bleep these guys out, but like Podcast One or Cadence, no, I'm kidding. We don't need to bleep them out. We don't need to bleep them out. They can have all the promo they want. Cadence 13 or, any of those other mid-roll, that sort of thing. On the surface, we look similar, but what sets us apart, I think, is the fact that we came up, we cut our teeth, we learned about the podcast space through this process of starting shows from the ground up, of being collaborative in the process of running everything soup to nuts. And now we're just trying to elevate that purpose for being further and further, to the point of, developing merch for shows and developing, doing more than just monetizing through ad sales, but monetizing through premium ad-free offerings and merch and affiliate and all the different streams of revenue that there are. Our goal is not just to take somebody who already has a successful podcast and make money off of it, but it's to find the people who are going to have the next successful podcast and then partner with them at the beginning and build them up into the success that they can finally be. So I think that that's the history of Kast Media, and also I think it informs what our purpose is, like the niche that we fill in the space too.
I am so genuinely happy to be a part of this, but I don't want to make this too much about us. I want to help people kind of figure out how they can monetize their own shows. You mentioned a couple of the different avenues, but I want to talk specifically about 3 ways. You would know better than me, but I feel like these are like the 3 core ways people can monetize is like through the ads and sponsors, affiliates, and selling your own products and services. And I just wanted to ask you, what do those 3 things look like in practice?
So the 3 you mentioned, ads, affiliates, and merch.
Your own products and services.
Your own products and services.
Merch, it can be business services,
True.
Anything like that.
True. Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking that through the merch side of things is kind of like if you're more of an educator or somebody who has that type of content marketing approach, then instead of merch, it's probably like informational products. On the surface level, ads will always be the least amount of revenue per listener, and followed, by merch and then products, probably products being the most money per customer. Affiliate, affiliate's probably just a trickle, all things considered, as compared with those other ones. But I think that the more niche or the more category specific a show is, the more that you have to expand the different revenue streams that there are to encompass a lot more than just advertising. But the idea of advertising inside of podcasting is usually what's sold as a 60-second mid-roll sponsorship, oftentimes a personal endorsement of a product or a brand from an influencer. And brands or agencies that are placing spend or whatever the case may be will pay based on the number of listeners of the show. That's the top line way that most people automatically assume that they're going to make money with a podcast. I think what's really important to consider is that's a way to make money where you're going to be happy with the revenue once you've hit 15, 20, 25,000 listeners, or not even happy with the revenue, but you'll start to see the revenue at that point. And then you start being happy with the revenue at say 50,000-ish. Listeners per episode, very important. Not listeners per month, not listeners on the show overall, none of that. We're talking about per episode, what you're hitting. But I think that that's why it's important to build in a lot of the extra revenue streams that we started talking about, because those other things really add up when you're talking about a show that's 15,000 or less, because you're only gonna have a small percentage of people will. One revenue stream that I think you didn't mention is the premium version. Premium
subscription.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that that is probably more potential revenue than the affiliate stuff. Just if you're considering top level, what's the best way to make as much money as possible out of the existing audience that you have?
So what would that look like? Would that just be you have sort of the flagship podcast that's free and then a premium subscription through Patreon or something to release like bonus episodes?
I think Patreon's great. I think if you have ads in the main thing, obviously you take them out for the Patreon one, and then you also throw in bonus stuff, and then you charge $7, $8, $10 a month or whatever it seems like it can sustain. And then if you have an audience of 10,000 and 100 pay $8 a month, you're making $800 a month off of that. And that's probably a lot more than you would be generating off of affiliates, maybe even merch.
Right.
And it's why at the simplest level, advertising revenue is going to be the least amount of money you'll make, but that's because you're making that money whether those people take any action or not. You're just making that money because brands want to show up to those people.
Well, that's also just casting your net wide rather than deep.
So the furthest level of efficiency you can get around monetizing a show, I like to think about it in simple numbers. Let's pretend like you've got 1,000 listeners and you advertise to all of them. You're making a very small amount of money off of all of them. If you have a $20 CPM, you're making $20 per ad. It's a smaller level than anybody is actually going to buy, but let's pretend like that's the case. So, whatever that math is, 1,000 divided by 20, that's how many cents you're making on each listener. But now if you have a ad-free bonus premium offering and 5 of those 1,000 people buy it, and it's $8 a month. Now that's $40 a month. And you only made $20 for the sponsorship spot at the beginning. So you're not those 5 people who bought it. Now those 5 ads aren't showing up to them, but you're making way more money off of those 5 people than you would have having the ad show up to them.
Plus, just watching you and the ad team work, it seems like it's a lot of effort to get those ad placements too.
Yeah. As the shows get smaller in audience size, there's a level of just diminishing returns because it's not very scalable. So that's the reason why if a show is doing less than, say, 50,000 listens per episode, it becomes tricky to use that as a model because the process is the sales portion is hard enough to begin with to get somebody on board with buying in, but then you have to get ad copy from them. They oftentimes have to set up a specific unique landing page for you, and they need to set up codes that give your listeners 20% off or whatever, and all of these different things. And then not only that, the talking points, they need to go in and make sure that you hit all the right stuff.
And they're so picky.
Because they're hoping to have make goods. A make good is when you say something wrong or you didn't follow it exactly right, and now they get a free ad out of you
and
because
they
you
look for that one little thing too.
So I think that's why you get diminishing returns below 50,000 listeners, because there's so much admin that goes along with it. So the highest level of efficiency is like you have 1 million listeners, it's way worth the admin.
Right.
Below 50,000, that's when it becomes a little bit tricky of like, is it actually worth all the admin that goes along with it?
And I feel like that also feeds into the importance of, if you do have a larger show, to join a network, because don't the ad companies buy in bulk. So they want X amount of impressions by X date, right? So they then like take a look at the catalog of shows and say, oh, I want this, this, and this. And then you guys are trying to hit that.
People don't know this, but there's all kinds of things that go on behind the scenes with the network to say, hey, if the spend hits this level, we can give you a discount on it. And then they're like, okay, we got to hit that level. So we're going to include this show and this show and this show that we didn't have included in the first place. And so now those shows are getting ad spend that they never would have had access to on their own. It never would have been a piece of the equation, but now the brand is trying to hit their discount. So they're willing to put up the extra money, and then they're including shows in it that they wouldn't have considered otherwise. And that's why it's kind of like a union, even though I have issues with unions, but it's kind of like that, where you're stronger together. When shows band together, now there's economics of scale that play into getting everybody more ad revenue.
How big does a show need to be to join a network? I'm sure it depends on the network, and I don't want this podcast to sound too much like a sales pitch for Kast, but it's more like the case study in which the business operates. So when you're looking to take on a new show, like a new existing show, what do you look for in terms of like audience, downloads, all of that?
Yeah, it's kind of a moving target, because what specifically advertisers are looking for is going to be constantly changing to some extent. At the moment, with the success of Joe Rogan and the number of guys who love to listen to themselves talk, and the number of people who think it would be fun to just chill with their buddies and smoke weed and, talk about nothing, that is not a category that's in demand. Joe Rogan's making a lot of money off of it, but that's not a category that's in demand.
Right.
What's in demand is female audiences, or audiences that are trying to improve themselves, better themselves, improve their own lives. In general, podcasting is exciting for advertisers because it tends to be millennials. It tends to be higher household income earners. It tends to be people who are busy. The crossover between podcast listener and Netflix subscriber is like 83%.
Wow.
It's like almost a perfect Venn diagram of those crossovers. And that's exciting because advertisers can't advertise on Netflix. Netflix doesn't do advertisements.
Right.
So in a lot of cases, podcast advertising is the only way to get in front of those people, because they're either driving to work, driving back from work, working out, or if they're sitting on the couch in front of the TV, it's Netflix. So where are you going to show up?
Right.
Podcasting. That's it. But anyways, that's a little bit of a tangent, but that's more of a pitch for why you should advertise in podcasting at all. But all of that to say, I think the more that you can differentiate yourself, like what we look for is audiences that are differentiated enough to be really interesting to advertisers.
Oh.
Queenie!
Oh.
She really wants to have a podcast. The amount of energy she has is absurd.
All right, let's drop back in. I think the best way to go about explaining this to people would be to make up a scenario. Let's say we're helping a guy named Bob who has a plumbing business start a podcast.
Ooh.
And how does he monetize such a niche, weird topic such as plumbing? And let's say he's been doing it for a while. His show gets 10,000 downloads an episode. He's a funny guy.
Shit.
He's a funny guy.
A lot of downloads.
Like he's in a heavy area.
Who's listening? What's his content? Why are they listening? Are they other plumbers?
Let's just say that he's really funny.
Okay.
And he happens to own a plumbing business that he uses the podcast to plug.
Okay.
And
But the podcast is not about plumbing.
Not inherently.
Okay.
But he makes it clear that he's a plumber and that he has a business in, let's say, New York, LA, some big city where there's a high density of people and a lot of people need his services.
Mm-hmm.
So now that I'm thinking about it, plumber probably isn't the best.
Well, it's a tough one. Okay. I don't want to get you off of this question because I think you're headed somewhere interesting with it. But I do think a common misconception is that podcasts make good top of the funnel content marketing content. And I don't think that they do. The reason I don't think that they do is because they are fundamentally they belong middle or bottom of the funnel. So we're talking about a sales funnel here, right? And a sales funnel, top level is where people discover you. And then you funnel them in, and those people who have discovered you get more and more interested until they buy at the bottom of the funnel. Top funnel things rely heavily on discovery.
Right.
Podcasting does not have good discovery built into it. The platform, the medium itself. Not only that, people aren't that interested in discovering. I mean, they are to some extent, but podcast listening is built on habits. And my habits, I want to build them around familiarity and shows that I know I like and shows that I can depend on listening every week to them. And that's why podcasters tend to listen to, 5 to 10 podcasts total. Right. And then they just continue to listen to them. And then they rotate through more, but it's a slow process versus as a YouTube viewer, I'm discovering things through search. And so I'm not coming back to the same people all the time. So now your plumber has a great content marketing top of funnel offering by saying, let me teach you how to change your faucet. And then when you go and you realize that it's more work than you thought it would be, I'm the person that you're going to think of calling. That's more of a top of funnel discovery focused thing. I think podcasting belongs more in the middle to bottom of funnel because it's so sticky. What it sacrifices in discoverability, it makes up for in its stickiness. So people
and longevity.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's what I mean. Like people who discover, subscribe, decide to buy into what you're doing, they're with you for the long haul. And so they'll be with you long enough for you to be able to sell to them, whether you're selling, especially online information-based products tend to do well, but even other things too. So it's a tough use case for pure traditional content marketing plumber stuff, whereas I could make the argument really well for a YouTube channel for your plumber. But it's for the right application, it's perfect because it's so sticky. It just doesn't, it's not what's going to get you initially discovered usually as a business owner.
But once it does, let's just talk about the value of podcasting then. Because, okay, so you're marketing yourself, let's say on YouTube, and you've built up a following. You're monetizing those streams, and you've got your podcasters or podcast listeners in for the long haul. What can you achieve through the podcast outside of the obvious? So advertisements, sponsors, affiliates, products, services. Mm-hmm. How else can you leverage having a successful podcast to grow your business?
Well, I think podcasting is built on ideas and the exchange of ideas. And it's why, we were playing around with different taglines for Kast. And I think the one that's sticking is amplifying ideas. It's the social media, if you will, of conversation, of idea exchange, of actual deeper content. And I think it's why it's so sticky. So top line, what you can do with a podcast is leverage it to demonstrate and to establish yourself as a thought leader, because conversations are all just the expression of thoughts. And I don't think that there's any better way to position yourself, whether it's as the leader of your company, whether it's yourself as an author, whether it's whatever it is, than through putting your ideas, conversations on blast for the world through a podcast. I mean, it's by far, I think that the medium itself lends itself to deep conversations, into ideas, and to way above and beyond the clickbait of YouTube, the images of Instagram, all of these different things. It's why it's the medium that I like the best, because it's the most
quality.
Yeah. If you get people to watch your 10-minute YouTube video, you're killing it. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yet people regularly stick around for hour and a half, 2 hour long. 2 hours is long, but like long podcast episodes. They regularly listen through the whole thing. Yeah. If the host is good and the ideas are good and the show's interesting.
I remember I recently looked up the stats behind podcast listeners for a different video, and it said that 80% of listeners listen to the entire episode, or at least most of it. And just looking at the analytics and iTunes, like, that is genuinely true. And that's wild.
Yeah.
Because like you said, the YouTube retention rates are horrible. What is it? People stick around for probably 2 minutes tops, if that.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on it would be more a percentage of the video, but yeah, like.
And that also ties back to the just sheer quality of the audience too, because like you said, the millennials, high earners, not very exposed to ads, just podcasts and Netflix. Mm-hmm. Whereas the common YouTube viewer is mostly kids, right?
No. It's just a broader bucket. It's just everyone. I think some of it too is that podcast has self-selected itself for a specific type of audience who's willing to figure out the podcast space. Because if you're anybody, like YouTube being controlled by a company has put billions of dollars into creating a user experience where it's very easy to learn how to navigate it. They've invested heavily in making sure that it's very easy to learn how to navigate it. Podcasting, not so much, And so I feel like the podcasting space has kind of self-selected itself for an audience that has invested the time and has, the mental capacity and time and effort and energy to figure it out, which it doesn't seem like to us, it doesn't seem like it's that hard, but it actually is. It takes a little bit to really get into it and to really get it as a podcast listener. It's why I tell people who are promoting their podcast to promote it, make sure that you're getting it in front of podcast listeners, because if around 25% of the US population listens to podcasts regularly, that 25% listens to, 4 to 9 hours a week. And then the other 75% listens to 0. So it's all or nothing. The value is not in getting in front of your friends and family and telling them to listen to your show, because they're going to go and, if they're not podcast listeners, they're not going to listen to it the right way, quote unquote. They're going to go to their computer and play it on the website or play it on iTunes on their desktop or whatever. Right. They don't have those podcast listener habits.
Not only that, not everybody is a podcast listener.
No.
Like, it's a very specific group of people that are listening to these shows, whereas like anyone can click on a YouTube video and watch it.
Mm-hmm.
But the podcasts...
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's the value, is like, you need to understand, and it's why maybe the plumber isn't the perfect example either, because maybe that crossover isn't quite right. Maybe the crossover is better for YouTube. Maybe the crossover is better for Facebook. Maybe, who knows? But I think you do want to take, any time that you're trying to see if a content marketing piece works for business, you do want to say, all right, who are my listeners? Where are they? What do they look like? How old are they? What's their gender? What's their household income? What's the whole avatar? And then say, how does that match up with the different mediums that are available? There's the social media platforms, YouTube, podcasting, all of that sort of thing. And podcasting is a very specific group of people, and who it's right for, it's perfect for, and who it's not right for, it's not, you know? It's why everybody thinks, not everybody thinks, but this comes up a lot. Like Gimlet and other places are trying to figure out how to crack the podcast for kids market. Kobe Bryant's trying to figure out how to crack the podcast for kids market. And it's with the podcast, The Punies. And it's not easy because kids aren't podcast listeners. Kids are YouTube viewers, right. You know? Like, it's a bit of a mistake. Podcast listeners are a specific group of people. Yeah. They're 23 years old to 40 years old. They're about 50-50 male and female, and they earn on average 20-25% more, and they are heavily on the coasts, unless it's true crime podcast, and then that's a different animal. But in general, right. Outside of that category, that's what it looks like.
So you don't think that the kids things are going to take off?
I think they'll take off once they can figure out how to get them listening on home devices like HomePod and Alexa and stuff like that. I think if I were them, I'd be putting all of my effort into that, because kids aren't going to listen to podcasts on their phone. People who have time on their hands, they watch videos because they have time. People who don't have time on their hands listen to podcasts because they don't have time. You know, it's why I just saw a study that said, I think the second most common reason people say they don't listen to podcasts is because they don't have the time. And I was like, then you don't understand podcasts. You don't understand. Right. You're just, all you're saying is that answer should be turned into, I don't understand podcasts.
Yeah, those are probably the same people watching hour-long podcasts on YouTube, thinking that it's just some people around a table and you're supposed to just sit here and watch them talk instead of just listening while you're doing tasks. That's
why I always tell people, like, when you're doing your focus group, which I highly recommend if you start launching a new podcast, the focus group of is this show good or not? It needs to be podcast listeners. Don't ask your grandma. Don't ask your mom and dad. Don't ask your siblings, or don't ask your friends unless they're podcast listeners. Yeah. And then do ask them. But because everyone else is going to sit there and listen on their computer, and they're going to be like, it's great because they love you, but they're going to be like, I just don't know if people have the time for this. Right. And that's a statement only people who don't understand podcasts would say.
What were your listening habits when you first discovered podcasts? Because I know mine were like, I used to live in rural Indiana on like a 2-acre piece of land. So it'd be like mowing my dad's yard, listening to podcasts, or like doing dishes, or just like redundant physical activities.
Yeah, same. Well, yeah, kind of. I didn't get interested in podcasts until I moved out here. I don't think I knew what a podcast was until I moved out here. And then 2 years later, I started Kast. But yeah, it would be commuting. It would be working out. It got to the point where I liked them so much that I was trying to listen while I was doing I still do this, right? You know, I'm trying to listen to podcasts while I'm doing things I really shouldn't, you know, because I don't have nearly as many mindless tasks as I used to, I feel like. Yeah. Same. I don't really, you know, there's not the number of like repetitive stuff that I used to have to do. And so now I'm still trying to listen to stuff because I want to. And then, you know, I'll look up from whatever I'm doing 20 minutes later and be like, well, I listened to a whole podcast episode and I don't remember one thing about it, but it was going, it was playing. But those were my habits. It's interesting because I think back at that time when I first started getting podcasts, I listened to a bunch of the shows we work with now, a bunch of the shows that we run now, which is kind of trippy and pretty cool and interesting. But I think it also is why I was able to be initially successful, because I was a listener. I was a fan, you know? So I got it. I understood it.
What would you say for the people that don't get it? Like, I don't know how to explain this person, but I know you know exactly who I'm talking about. The wannabe podcaster that just doesn't get the industry. What?
The podcaster?
Yeah. Like, oh, I want to start a podcast. Knows nothing about podcasts.
We get pitched this sort of thing all the time where people are like, yeah, I want to have a podcast. I think, you know, what are the music rights like? Because I want to, you know, play some tunes, and I want to talk, you know, like the idea of somebody who thinks that it's a radio station that they're just putting out as a digital product offering, you know? Yeah. People who think that they're going to be playing songs on their podcast. What would I say to them? I don't have time. No, I don't really know. I mean, honestly, I really think it's why I get so excited when somebody comes in here who you can tell in talking to them that they're fans of podcasting,
right?
Of podcasts. They're fans of whatever the niche is that they love. They do love it because they get it. And it's one of the most important elements. Like, yeah, people who come in here and they're like, yeah, I don't listen to any, but I got this great idea. It's going to be amazing. And I'm like, you don't have any idea if it's going to be amazing or not because you don't know what's working. Like, podcasting is very insular to podcasting, meaning that's very inside of that space. And so I don't just say anything that works on TV won't necessarily work in podcasting. And I think a lot of people think that because this would be a really cool project for TV or for a movie or something like that, let's just do it in podcasting. It doesn't work that way. People have very specific things that they want inside of podcasting. That's not to say that we can't expand that, but expanding that is going to be it's not an especially financially viable path to take with the project. It's worth the effort, maybe, but it has to have a lot of ingredients of things that we're seeing already a lot of stickiness with. For example, you want to do a podcast about some gritty cop from wherever, and that's great. Sounds cool. Sounds like a cool, The Wire sort of TV show podcast thing. Maybe it's going to work, but let's sprinkle in a solid elements of true crime, whodunit stuff. Let's sprinkle in, you know what I mean? Let's sprinkle in elements of what we've seen working throughout the podcast industry in a project that's trying to push it forward.
Which I feel like kind of throws it back to the music industry and how you want to be pushing the boundaries of what's popular, but you have to kind of color within the lines of what's happening right now. Mm-hmm. Because although there is room for massive growth in the narrative podcast space, the formula is the successful formula is largely the same, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's why you see Wondery, probably the most well-known name in podcasting besides Serial or This American Life or whatever. Wondery puts out a bunch of interesting podcast projects, but they make all their money and all their success off of Over My Dead Body, Dirty John, and Dr. Death. That's where they make all their money.
Well, are they hedging their bets going into that? Are they just producing a bunch and whatever one hits covers the rest? Or
no, I think they're being smart. I think they're being smart about saying these are sure bets. These will bankroll more of pushing the envelope ideas, and less of those pushing the envelope ideas will hit and be successful. But we're okay because we're doing enough run-of-the-mill true crime that everyone wants to listen to. That's where we make our money, and that's where we fund the other projects.
Kind of going on a tangent right now, but what about ghost stories? Because I just realized
what about them?
There's a lot of people making podcast style ghost story videos on YouTube where it's just maybe a 2D image or a slightly animated image, but it has all the elements of a podcast. So there's a narrator going through the story. There's musical and sound effect elements bringing it to life, maybe other voice actors too. I feel like that would be an interesting space to break into. It's not necessarily true crime, but there's got to be a base for that, right?
Depends. Maybe. I automatically go to who are the listeners. I'm really aggressively looking for... The reason that I would be hesitant about that is because, well, first of all, I don't really know exactly. I don't have an example of what you're talking about. Who do you think the viewer is? Who do you think the listener or viewer is?
Probably teenage or young women.
On the ghost stories?
Yeah. Maybe kids. I'm not sure. Definitely, I feel like it'd skew younger and female.
Because the proxy we have for, by proxy, I mean the example that we have for stuff that's working, say the true crime stuff that's working, is heavily female, 80, 90% female. And, 25-ish on the younger end tend to be more in the 30s, mid 30s, 40 at the upper end. And I think that is a disconnect with a lot of people when they're like, oh, true crime works, so horror should definitely work. And it's like, no, those are opposite audiences. They feel like similar content.
Okay.
They're opposite audiences because horror is heavily male.
Really?
And young, you know?
Huh.
So, I mean, not to say that horror won't work. I think that it can work, but it needs to be a specific type of horror that really appeals to a female demographic, which means that it kind of needs to not be over the top, you know? Like it's a really interesting thought experiment to try to figure out, because there's these different niches and categories of what work inside of podcasting. And I think a lot of people are drawing conclusions about true crime that aren't really applicable because the demographic isn't really exactly what they would think it would be without having been in it.
I kind of want to take a hard left turn.
Yank it back to the practical. I feel like
I want to touch on these scripted narrative shows. I want to make one more point before we move on. I do want to talk more about the ad sales and the ad sales process. Mm-hmm. But producing a narrative show, whether it be true crime or whatever, is incredibly difficult from all angles. Maybe not difficult, but very time consuming. So what would you say to somebody who is interested in producing a true crime show with the works? So multiple voice actors, music, sound effects, but extremely limited budget. Like if they are producing it themselves, essentially, without a network, how does one even go about that? Or even should they?
I think the reason it's so hard to pull off is because even what you laid out, I don't think is really the roadmap to a successful true crime show, the voice actor part of things. Because what's working tends to not be voiceover. It tends to be this not found footage, but investigative journalism on the field, doing interviews with people sort of thing, which again elevates the level of difficulty way higher. Because it'd be one thing if you could accomplish the category by getting your friends to come in and read a script, you know? And that's what a lot of people, I think what Wondery and other people would like to be what people are looking for when they produce these podcasts like Business Wars and stuff like that are essentially just dramatized stories with a narrator and a bunch of voice actors. That's a relatively easy way to go about it, but it's not what is hitting like how Dr. Death and Dirty John and Serial and all these things, all these really successful ones hit. The true crime podcasts that really hit are from one person usually going out and investigating something and interviewing people about it and then piecing together all of those interviews, and there's no voice acting going on. And it means you've got to capture hundreds and hundreds of hours of interviewing and audio in order to come up with it. And then you got to come up with a narrative that weaves through all that. It's really hard. It's really hard.
Don't you have a case study? I think it was with Suspect Convictions, taking what was it, the show or an episode from like 0 to 1 million downloads?
Yeah, when we launched it. Yeah.
When you launched it?
Mm-hmm. So when we launched that podcast, we were working with Scott Reeder, the host of the show, and started working with him 3 or 4 months before the podcast launched. We got him booked on other shows like Undisclosed and
this is in the true crime space, just to let people know.
We got him booked on a bunch of other shows, not to talk about Suspect Convictions, but to talk about that case. So Undisclosed, whatever their current case was, and other podcasts too. And then, you know, because his background was an investigative journalist, so he had value to bring to these other podcasts as a contributor. And he did the work of digging into their case and being like, I think I've got something interesting to say about this case. He came to the table with that, and we had them drop all those episodes, you know, the week of release when Suspect Convictions came out. And and the podcast, the show as a whole, did 1 million downloads in 3 weeks. And that was off of only a few episodes being released. So we're talking about several 100,000 per episode.
And that's crazy for podcasts. That's normal in YouTube, but podcasts, that's
it's a lot.
wild. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not, those are big numbers for podcasting.
Yeah.
Podcasting is a different animal. I mean, some of the most popular podcasters who go on Ellen and everywhere else do 200,000 downloads an episode, which is a lot of downloads. But like, if you're a YouTuber with 200,000, like, don't even,
You're a failure.
Yeah, don't even. Well, now let's be. But don't check your bank account for sure.
Yeah, right.
But if you're a podcaster with 200,000, you're making cash.
How much?
Depends on how many episodes you're releasing. Depends on who your audience is. If it's a comedy show, it's less. If it's a female-oriented podcast, it's more. If it's a how-to educational thing, it's more. If you're putting out more episodes per week, it's more. But, one episode per week at 200,000 listeners and an established show can make $500,000-$600,000 a year in ad revenue. That's just ad revenue. It can be more than that, but it could be less than that too.
And that only stacks when you sell your own products and services on top of that. Because let's take, for example, someone in the self-help entrepreneurship space who's getting, let's say, 100,000 downloads. But on top of that, they might offer coaching. They might offer products. They might have affiliates. What do you think the earning potential is there?
I don't know. I mean, I think that there's different levels of fully monetizing an audience. And I think that what you're talking about, where all of those pieces are in place, including products and offerings, maybe there's even merch, who knows, let's call it a premium version of the show with extra bonus content and affiliate revenue. There's an element of scale, like I said, with the advertising, where if your show that does 200,000, you're making a certain amount. I don't know what the numbers are, but pretend like at 200,000 listeners, you make 10 cents per listener off of ads. At 50,000 is a quarter. What I'm trying to say is that it doesn't scale down, like as you have a larger audience, you also make more per audience member off of ads than you had at a smaller audience. So there's a big element of scale there where it hockey sticks. But I guess what I'm trying to say with that is, if at 1 million you made $1 per, at 100,000 you don't still make $1 per. You make 20 cents per. Yeah,
that's
whatever it is.
So your audience becomes more valuable the bigger it gets.
Because more people are willing to. For instance,
that's very new media too, because it works the other way in TV, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, I mean, it depends too. I mean, in some ways, as you grow, you become less niche too. So, we have shows where at 50,000 listeners, they could charge $50 CPMs. But now that they're at 300,000 listeners, it doesn't make sense to charge those kind of CPMs because they have a much broader audience. Back in the day, it was only like entrepreneurs listening. And now it's entrepreneurs and a lot of other people. So the CPMs can go down in that case, but other people, their influence just grows. Some political shows can make way more now because they're household names, and that's just what they command. But anyways, to go back to your question, I think on a general non-niche, non-category specific, call it a comedy show or something, if you've got your premium and your merch and your affiliate stuff set up, you can be doubling your ad revenue off of that extra stuff. On something that is niche category specific, you could be making significantly more off of those products. Call it products or merch. In my mind, they're like the same thing. If you're in the educational space, it's products. If you're not in the educational space, it's merch.
Got it.
But if you're a smaller thing, then you can be making significantly more probably off of those than off of the ad revenue. So whatever your ad revenue would be, double it. Yeah. And if you're at 50,000 or less, probably more than double it.
Wow. Just for fun, and I know this is heavily dependent on circumstance, but could you throw some numbers out?
For what?
For a comedy show getting those number of downloads, how much is coming from ad revenue? How much is coming from the subscription? How much merch, etc.?
Okay. So
Just rough numbers. Of course, this is all dependent on a million different things, but just for fun.
Let's pretend you got a comedy show. You've got an audience of 100,000. You're doing advertising, and at 100,000, you can make some good money for sure off of advertising. Although you're comedy, so your CPMs, cost per 1,000 listeners, is going to be not $35, not $30, probably not even $25, probably low 20s, somewhere in the low 20s, upper teens. So call it $20. So one spot, one ad on your podcast costs $2,000. You take 100,000 divided by 1,000, because we're talking about CPM, which is cost per 1,000 listeners. Divide 100,000 by 1,000 and multiply that by the CPM, which is 20. And that's how you get that $2,000 for a spot. And your comedy, so there's not a massive amount of demand. So maybe we're not talking about selling 4 spots per episode. We're talking about selling 2 spots per episode on average. So in advertising, you're making $4,000 per episode. You're putting out 4.3 episodes per month because you have a weekly show. So that's 16 grand. It's over, call it $17,500 per month.
Okay.
Through advertising. And then I think as a comedy show, especially if you're good and if you're a comedy show with 100,000 listeners, people like your stuff.
Yeah.
And you're good and you're funny. So if you're being smart about your merch offerings, you're probably rotating through different things. So your t-shirts have some sort of in joke from like the last episode, and your mugs or your all of these things, like they're probably, you're creative people. You're not just putting your podcast cover on the mug and trying to sell that. Your merch sales are not going to be good that way. But if you have limited run offerings that somehow make people, when they buy it, they make people feel like they're part of an in group of people who get it, like a small number of people who get it. Like Crystalia has shirts or whatever that are like, that have his catchphrases on them. Like doesn't make a dent, That's what he likes to say about like when he spends money and it doesn't make a dent on his bank account. You know what I mean? Like you have like these and those things like sell like wildfire, because like people who listen to Crystalia, they love him, and buying that makes them like part of this in group of people who like get it, So if you're being efficient about that sort of thing, there's no reason to think you couldn't be making the same amount off of that you are off of the ads. So now you go from the 16K to 32K off of that. And then with 100,000 listeners, if you have a good premium offering where it's not just ad free, but it's got some extra stuff, it's got behind the scenes stuff, it's got extended from the, like extended interview stuff, all of this stuff, let's say you get 2%. Let's say you get 1% of people to sign up for that.
So 1,000. Pretty
solid number, really. Yeah. And you pay and you charge $8. So you're making an extra 8,000 off of that. Now you're at 30, 40. Now you're at 32 plus 8 is 40. Now you're at 40,000 a month. And the affiliates is like, if you're on a super, like you're teaching people how to use email marketing software, and then MailChimp is your affiliate, you can make good money off of that. But if you're in comedy, it's probably just going to be a trickle. You're going to mention something and then throw up an Amazon link, and you're going to make $1 or $2 off of it.
So that would equal
on 100,000 listeners, honestly, in comedy, you're not making more than $1,000 or $2,000 a month off of it. So there you are, 41,
42,
$42,000 a month, whatever that is per year, $500,000.
That's good money.
It's good money,
and
it's doable.
It's definitely
there were a lot of elements we threw into that, because you can't just turn on one and think it's all going to work.
Right, and a lot of people are missing out on the other opportunities. And also, although podcasts are work, it's not going to be a full-time job for the host to even create a show that big and monetize to that level. So your earning power is exponential.
Look, there's no gatekeepers. Here's the reason why. Like the reason why those numbers seem crazy, because it's like 100,000. Surely you can get to 100,000. I mean, it's not easy, but
Right.
If you're real good at what you do, you can definitely get to 100,000. those numbers seem crazy because we're so used to dealing with gatekeepers who take most of the money.
Yeah.
Whether those gatekeepers are Spotify, whether those gatekeepers are YouTube, whether those gatekeepers are the networks, ABC, whoever, there was a real element of distribution at play with every medium that you're going to get into. So if you're Gordon Ramsay, you're making $250,000 per episode off of MasterChef. That seems like great money until you realize how much the networks are making off of MasterChef. But in podcasting, you're not getting that fee. You're getting the reality of whatever it is minus whatever your ad sales team takes as a commission,
Right.
or whatever your network takes or whatever that, you know what I mean? So you are the network, or your YouTube. That's why there's more money in podcasting, because there's no extra layer there like there is everywhere else.
And you've got a unique business model. I'm not sure if you'd want to talk about this on record, but
On record.
yeah, I don't want to let out the tricks of the trade, but I think you've got something really interesting going on in that your deals with a lot of the hosts is just a percentage cut of ad revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And under that is the production and all the other work that it takes to get to that point is all included. And I don't feel like other agencies do that.
No. Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, so the structure of our deal normally, and we do this deal mostly with influencers or celebrities or comedians or somebody who has some existing audience to leverage, is that we run everything soup to nuts and we take a cut, and it's a significant cut. It's not over the top, but it's significant enough to where we build in all of our costs of the studio, the employees, the ad sales team, the hosting cost, all of this stuff gets all wrapped up inside of our cut, so that the influencer, celebrity, comedian, whoever it is, they just come, they show up, they record, we work with them to make sure that the content is going to be as good as it possibly can be, and then it's all taken care of. And they don't have to hire a production team. They don't have to choose a hosting solution, get it set up, and then pay for hosting. They don't have to do all these other things. It's all wrapped up, inside of it. And that's why at the beginning of our conversation, I was saying that that's how we're different from Cadence or Podcast One or any of those people, because we're very collaborative. We start shows from the ground up a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times. And we take on risk, Most of those other people, they're very happy to sign deals with shows that are doing 100, 200, 300, 400,000 downloads per episode. And I am too. I'm very happy to sign those deals too. But what we also do is sign deals at zero, because we're willing to risk and bet on the right shows and that they're going to be successful in the future.
That's awesome. Before we wrap up, let's go through the ad sales process, because I have to say that's the area I'm least plugged into. So it'll be interesting for me to hear this too. But what does it take to get, let's say, Uveda or whatever podcast product it is? What does it take to get that in a show and get paid out?
It varies from case to case. It's why, we and other people have a full sales team, because there's so many different equations to deal with. Sometimes it's a relationship with an agency that specializes in a specific kind of deal with their brands, where the brand goes to them saying, hey, we are willing to pay $5 per, sign up. And the agency says, great, here's how we can get that. And then they test a show. And if you hit their $5 per sign up, then they'll keep going with you. And the agency runs all of that. And our relationship is managing that process with the agency to help them hit their goals. Sometimes it's a broader agency that just does large ad spend for broad brand recognition, like Hulu campaigns or Netflix campaigns or Toyota or whatever, those sorts of things. That's a completely different model where the agency is not invested in a cost per acquisition, CPA situation. They're purely trying to get broad level brand awareness. And so they're trying to get in front of the right demographic. So those people are going to ask you questions like, household income, gender split, those sorts of things, versus the direct response ones. They will ask those questions, but at the end of the day, the only reason they'll continue with you is because it works, quote unquote.
Well, let me ask you this. What's the independent podcaster that's doing everything themselves? What are they doing to get in touch with these agencies? Are they just giving them a call, emailing them, or what are the proper channels to go through to start this process?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough to get into the agencies as an individual podcaster. It's why it's good to join a network, because agencies have limited capacity to run spreadsheets and figure everything out. And so if they have to deal with a different person for every podcast, that's not very efficient for them. They love to deal with, a mid-roll that has 500 shows or whatever, like that's really easy. That's a really easy relationship for them. Now, that's not to say you can't do it. We got plugged in with several agencies when we only had one show to sell. And that was through cold emailing. But to tell you the truth, we found out about those agencies because we cold emailed the brands until the brands responded, because we were like, oh, MeUndies advertises in podcasting. So I'm going to email every email I can find from MeUndies. And then finally somebody was like, we work with Oxford Road. And I was like, great. So then I looked up what's Oxford Road, and then Oxford Road. Oh, it turns out that they handle 60 brands. Great. That just made my life way easier. I just need to get, I just need to have conversations at Oxford Road. That's an example. There's not that many agencies in the space. Some of them will not be open at all to the idea of dealing with independent podcasters, and some of them will be, Oxford Road is one that does deal with a lot of independent, not just networks. That's the only process that I can really say that in terms of what's worked for us, because now we're at a level where we understand, because, we have a full sales team that kind of understands the entire ecosystem. It's really tough. Like when I started out, it was just me without any clue of how any of this stuff works, saying, well, I hear MeUndies, so I'm just going to email them and find out, And hopefully this can help people skip some of those steps. But the reality is, as an independent podcaster, say you're doing less than 30,000 downloads an episode, maybe you're doing less than 15,000 downloads an episode, there's still money to be made off of advertising on your show, probably not through agencies. Agencies don't tend to buy that way. But the nice thing is you're the perfect salesperson. Like a perfect sales team would be like the host of the show on the phone with brands, right? So you're the perfect salesperson for your thing, because you get it. You know who your audience is. You know what they like. You know what they dislike. You know everything about them. So I would leverage that and go direct to the brands that would be perfect for your audience. Right. If it's an entrepreneurial audience, go to brands that are really solving a problem that that your audience has, and then talk to those brands and make sure that it's whatever you're offering to them, it's priced at a level where if you were on the other side of that call, it would make sense for you to greenlight the ad spend. And as long as you can really say that in your mind that like, yes, this would make sense given what I know about my audience, how engaged they are, how much they take action when I tell them to take action, then you can have that conversation with individual brands. I think if you're a podcast that does 50,000 or more and you want to stay independent, you don't want to join a network, that's fine. You can get into these agencies. If you're a podcast that does 50 or 30 or less, your time is better spent finding the perfect brands and talking directly with the brands, because the agencies don't really have the time to do the smaller one-offs.
That's amazing. I feel like that's gonna help a lot of people, because even if you are a smaller show, monetizing for you might mean just covering expenses. Mm-hmm. That way it's not the production of your passion project isn't coming directly out of your pocket from your job, because that extra, I think we mentioned $800 a month for just the premium subscription earlier in the episode. Like that's a lot of money.
Yep.
And that can really help get you moving in the right direction.
It's an exciting moment when you can start to cover your expenses off of doing what you love to do, Like, I think that what keeps people from working as hard as they should be working at what they want is because they don't see the results of their work immediately.
Right.
So whatever you can do to start to see the results, that's what's going to start the chain reaction of motivation. If podcasters could see two paths in front of them. One where they spent 40 hours working on being booked as a guest on other shows, and one where they didn't spend 40 hours working as being guests on a show. And then they see the result 40 hours down the road. Nobody would not choose the 40 hours worth of work.
Right.
But they don't see that. You know, you don't see it that clearly. You can't see the future like that. So all you need to do is, if you can find a way to do something that gets results, then you can start to have that ecosystem of results helps motivation, helps results, helps motivation, and that kind of give and take.
Well, also realistic expectations. I feel like going into it, a lot of people think that podcasts are similar to YouTube, but it's a slow burn.
Yeah.
Like you're playing the long game.
Yeah.
In podcasts.
Well, it's a product of the fact that, like we said before, instead of ABC, there's us, there's podcasters. And so it's high risk, high reward. Because if you're a podcaster who does 1 million downloads an episode, there's very few podcasts that do 1 million downloads an episode, but some true crime shows do. So, you are doing more, you have a larger audience than a lot of TV shows.
Yeah.
And that means that in reality, while the advertising world is still catching up with this fact, your audience is more valuable than a lot of TV shows. And it's just you, or it's you and your team, or whatever the case may be. So we're talking about with the democratization of the pipes, there's no such thing as distribution anymore. There's like marketing instead, but distribution isn't really a thing because viewers are everywhere, listeners are everywhere, people are everywhere, and you can get to all of them. If you can find a way to establish that kind of audience, we're talking about a massive amount of reward, the kind of reward that only used to be available to ABC when they put out their new sitcom that they were hoping could get that kind of audience.
Crazy.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to see where this industry goes. 2 more things. I want to also say this, because I feel like a lot of people, especially the independent podcasters that are doing everything themselves, that are thinking, oh, I need to monetize the show. I need to monetize the show. Why are my CPM so low? I don't have enough downloads to really make a lot of money. But the thing is you're learning valuable skills simply by producing your own show. Take yourself as an example. You were producing your own podcast. You took the skills learned doing that and built an entire company off of that. So you just have to be creative when it comes to monetizing, because if you're working, let's just say a 9-to-5 job at a factory somewhere in the Midwest, but you have a podcast that does 10,000 downloads and it's something you're truly passionate about, there's no reason why you couldn't leverage the skills producing that show and advertising to your audience that, hey, I'm gonna offer this service to, if anybody's interested, I'll help you start a podcast. Here's how to do it. And then take on all that back end work of doing the post-production or even the production if it's somebody in your area. Then at that point, you're basically at the grounds of a network, because then you could approach the advertising agencies with, oh, I've got 2 shows doing this many downloads. Not only would you sell more ads, you'd be helping someone else make money and could even take a cut of that if you're doing all the legwork. Mm-hmm. There's so much growth in this industry. And what we've been saying this whole time is a lot of people just don't get it yet and capitalize on it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, there's so many good. I've talked to plenty of people who have started a podcast that didn't really turn into anything, including myself. And I've never talked to anybody who didn't say that it was a super valuable experience and a really good experience, whether you're hosting one, whether you're working with one, whatever you're doing, it's extremely valuable. And it's, in some ways it's a resume builder. Look, especially if you can position it the right way. I'm reading this book called 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, and it's about the difference between 1 to 100 and 0 to 1, and the fact that 0 to 1 is way harder than 1 to 100.
Oh, really?
Because 1 to 100 is just reevaluating what's working and going in on it. it's way easier to start from something and build up.
Okay.
But innovation is 0 to 1.
Right.
So 0 to 1 is what you need to figure out. And it's the same inside of podcasting. Like, it's not 0, right? Because you have friends and family. But like, let's pretend it's essentially 0 because you've got, 50 people listening, and it's friends and family and people who support you. And, that's the reason that they're listening. If you figured out how to go from that to 1,000, then you have all of the tools you need to go from 1,000 to 100,000.
Right.
Because that was the hard part, So anyways, all of that to say, I think the process of reevaluating and trying to figure out how to put out something that connects, how to distribute it, and then how to get it in front of people, how to market it, and how to network and build it into something, if it is one of the most valuable skills you can have, because it's one of the most rare and difficult to learn skills, that 0 to 1 thing.
One final question.
Okay.
I feel like I've said this 10 times now. But if you were to restart today from nothing, except for the experience you've gained in the past 3 years running the company, what would you do? Would you start a podcast, or would you start a podcast network?
So that's the question. I thought the question was more like if you were going to restart modern musicians specifically.
Let's do both.
I love the business side of things. I'm at least currently less of an on-air personality. And I think a smarter thing that I did early on was recognizing that and reevaluating and going all in on
the business.
Yeah, the business side of things. Because that's also just like what excites me, what I love. Not that, I love talking too. I love the sound of my own voice. But like, really, I think I have more to bring to the table in how I can see trends and I can apply them elsewhere. What I was talking about as far as like, if a show is going to work or not, if a category is going to work, if a niche is going to work or not, that sort of thing. That's just pattern recognition. That's just me trying to understand the patterns of what I see every day going on in the industry, and then apply them to futures in which we do this show or we don't do this show, or futures in which we do this kind of advertising or we don't do this kind of advertising. We go all in on programmatic, pre-produced, demographically targeted advertising, or we don't, So, all of that to say, I think I wouldn't change anything. Obviously, I wouldn't change anything just because I like the path that we took to get here. And I think it's one of it's one of the elements that sets us apart, makes it so much different from the other networks that are out there. So I wouldn't change that path, but I think I would have definitely gone in on the advertising side of things earlier. And I would have invested in the talent that it's tough. In business, you're always balancing different objectives. Okay. And the short-term objective is cash flow, because you're not going to be around tomorrow if you don't have cash flow. The long-term objective is positioning in the marketplace and understanding all of those things. And so positioning in the marketplace, having the right people on your team, all of those things lead to great cash flow in the future, versus short-term objectives where you need to make payroll and you need to make rent and you need to make, you need to make all these things happen within the next 30, 60, 90 quarter, 2 quarters, year. I think what I've always tried to do is balance those two objectives as well as we could. I think that there's always ways that you could go more in on the long term. We could have gone more in on investing in the big shows, investing in relationships, and building up marketing or building up market penetration, where instead of that, we kind of went all in on finding shows that were willing to pay us $800, $1,000 a month to produce them.
Right.
And there's a longer term goal than that. But then again, that strategy led us to position ourselves in a place where we've got all of the producers and the personnel and the people on hand. We don't just have a sales team. We've got everything. So I don't know. I think, first of all, I'm very happy with where Kast is. And I wouldn't change anything about that. I think I would have tried to build in the network ad sales side earlier, because I knew that was the future, but it was hard to get going at first. It's really hard to get going at first. now that we're there, then it's great. But it took a couple of years before we even really started trying to push that direction. And I think we could have pushed that direction sooner. But the other element of all of this is that there's a lot of interesting tech going on inside of podcasting. And there's elements that Kast is working on and bringing to the table of tech where market penetration is going to be extremely important to developing adoption of that tech. And so in some ways, I think we've played it out perfectly because we're positioned right for that based on the fact that we have always prioritized building up audiences for different shows and establishing, relationships between those hosts and those shows. And that's going to position us right for the future. So I don't know. There's so many things going on that are playing out the way that I want them to, that I would be very hesitant to change anything, because what if it had all kinds, there's always unintended consequences, There always is.
Always.
So you have to be, I don't know. I'm happy with my life. I wouldn't want to change places with anyone, and I wouldn't want to change anything in the past really either, because it might change current things that I would want it to change,
Didn't we have a talk like this like a month ago about the fabric of space and time? I forget what it was.
It seems like something we might have to talk about. But I don't know.
Well, thank you so much for this. Like I mean it genuinely.
Well, thank you. No, thank you. This was super fun. I think a lot of times we just there's so many things that are demanding of our time to get done, that having the opportunity to kind of sit back and actually process things, you don't do unless you have to, you're made to do them in a situation like this. And it's super valuable.
It's kind of the point where I'm sure you're like this 1,000 times over. If I don't schedule something out, I just magically don't have the time.
Yeah, doesn't happen. Yeah, no, it's so true.
And when we're at work, our whole team is on. Mm-hmm. We are the hardest working people I know. This ping pong table
doesn't even get used.
Hasn't seen any love in months.
I know, it's it's kind of sad. We should be a little lazier.
I don't know about lazier.
Maybe we should be a little bit more ping pong focused. No, you're right. The Kast team works harder than anybody I know. It's insane. It's crazy.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was what it's like to do a podcast, I guess.
Hour and a half. Damn.
Damn.